Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's pretty unusual, at least in modern U.S. presidential history,
Okay.
and that is presidents who chose not to run for a second term.
Interesting.
It might seem counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
You'd think you'd want to hold on to all that power.
Right.
But as you'll see, the reasons for stepping aside are as diverse as the presidents themselves. And we're going to be using the very recent news of President Biden's decision to not seek re-election as sort of our jumping off point
Okay.
for this deep dive.
Gotcha.
So to kind of get us started here,
Yeah.
President Biden's announcement on July 21st, 2024, with just 183 days left in his term, I mean, that's pretty close.
It's cutting it close.
Really shook things up in the political world. And to understand why this is such a big deal, it helps to remember that for most presidents, a second term is almost a given. It's a chance to solidify their agenda and really leave their mark on history. It's almost like reaching the top of a mountain. You want to enjoy the view for a while, right?
Yeah. You don't want to just climb down.
Right back down.
So what makes Biden's decision so unusual? We'll be looking at an episode of American History Hit
Okay.
with host Don Wildman, who you might know from Mysteries at the Museum.
Yeah.
And historian Kevin Cruz to
Hey.
kind of help us unpack this whole thing. So to kind of get us started, it's important to acknowledge that Biden at 81 is the oldest sitting president
Yes.
in U.S. history.
In U.S. history.
So there's been a lot of public discussion about his age and mental acuity, and some speculate that this played a role in his decision.
That's fair.
But then again,
Yeah.
he could just not want to do it anymore.
True.
You know that first debate
I was just thinking about that.
with Donald Trump back in 24
Oh, God.
kind of comes to mind.
It was.
Well, let's just say it wasn't Biden's best performance.
Not his finest moment. And this is totally unprecedented. No other president has faced this kind of pressure to step down because of age-related concerns, especially so close to an election.
That's right.
I mean,
And the historian in the episode, Kevin Cruz,
yeah.
draws a parallel to President Lyndon B. Johnson back in 1968. He also chose not to run for a second full term.
Right.
So,
On the surface, it does seem like it.
it was very similar.
Two presidents deciding not to run again.
Yeah.
But to dive a little deeper here, LBJ inherited the presidency after JFK's assassination, and he won a landslide victory in '64.
Right.
But then came Vietnam, and things kind of went downhill.
Yeah, the Vietnam War completely changed the political landscape for him. And he was under intense pressure with protests raging across the country. I mean, you could probably feel the tension and division
Oh, I bet.
with those chants of, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Oh, gosh.
Echoing outside the White House. I mean, he really felt like he was trapped by the war and that he'd lost the public's trust.
Right. So while both Biden and Johnson stepped down, their motivations were very different. It's a good reminder that context is crucial.
Exactly. Context is key. You can't compare oranges to oranges.
Yeah. You can't just make surface-level observations.
And something else that I think is interesting here
Okay.
is that the whole idea that presidents should aim for 2 terms is actually a relatively recent development.
Yeah.
It really solidified after Franklin D. Roosevelt served an unprecedented 4 terms.
Hold on. 4 terms.
4 terms.
So before FDR, was it common for presidents to just serve 1 term and be done?
That's right. In the 19th century, presidents often campaigned on a single-term promise. And the presidency was seen as less powerful back then, with Congress holding more sway. So it was more about fulfilling a civic duty, getting things done, and then stepping aside.
Right.
It was less about that.
Gotcha. So they weren't necessarily thinking about their legacy as much.
Yeah, less about legacy, more about service. But then when FDR came around, and he spent all that time in office, and the federal government's role expanded dramatically,
Right.
it was like the presidency went from being a manager to a CEO.
Right.
So it became what historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called the imperial presidency, a much more powerful position with the potential for lasting legacy.
Wow. This completely changes how you think about the office.
It does, right.
Yeah.
It's not just about ambition, it's about the evolution of the presidency itself
Right.
and how our expectations have changed over time.
Okay, so we've seen how Vietnam shaped LBJ's decision and how FDR's lengthy time in office changed the game entirely. But let's jump forward a few decades and look at another president who chose to walk away, Harry Truman.
Yes. Truman's situation was unique in its own way because he had actually taken over after FDR's death. and then won the 1948 election against all odds.
Wow.
But by 1952, he was facing some plummeting approval ratings and a resurgent Republican Party. So he kind of read the writing on the wall.
It seems like the political climate plays a huge role in these decisions.
Absolutely. Presidents are constantly evaluating their chances, the mood of the nation, and the strength of their opposition.
Right.
It's a strategic game, and stepping aside is sometimes just the smartest move.
Right. So it sounds like he had some self-awareness there.
Yeah.
Realized maybe it was just time. But not everyone makes decisions based solely on political calculations.
Right.
Take, for example, Calvin Coolidge.
Silent Cal.
Now, this guy was president during the Roaring '20s, a time of great economic prosperity and social change. But get this, he just didn't like the job.
He straight up didn't like it.
I mean, you think being president would be pretty fun.
You'd think so, right?
It's like the top job.
The most powerful man in the world.
And he's just like, eh.
Yeah, I'd rather take a nap.
So yeah, Coolidge, often referred to as Silent Cal, believed in limited government intervention and, just basically found the presidency kind of a bit
boring.
Dull.
Oh, yeah.
There are even anecdotes about White House ushers finding him asleep at his desk with his feet up.
Can you imagine that?
I mean, it's really hard to picture any president these days admitting they find the job boring.
No, I can't imagine that either.
It really highlights how personal preferences
play a role.
And views on the role of government can factor into a president's decision.
Absolutely.
Not everyone thrives in that kind of high-pressure, always-on environment.
Makes sense.
Even if it is the most powerful job in the world.
It's true.
So we've got Biden, LBJ, Truman, and even Coolidge all choosing to walk away from a potential second term. It makes you wonder if there's some kind of second-term curse. The idea that presidents face more trouble in their second go-around.
Yeah, the second-term curse. It's a popular concept. Yeah. But it's not really a hard and fast rule.
So it's not really a curse, just maybe like...
Maybe this is the reality of governing. Think about it. By the second term, a president is a known entity.
Yeah.
They've had time to make mistakes. They've had time to, alienate potential allies. The public might simply just be looking for a change.
Right.
And let's not forget the media. They tend to scrutinize second-term presidents.
I'm sure.
Even more closely.
Yeah.
Looking for any sign of slippage or scandal.
Right.
They're just waiting for them to make a mistake.
It's like that honeymoon period is over, and now it's time to face the music.
Exactly.
Right.
But what's truly fascinating is what happens when an incumbent does step aside. Historically, it hasn't been great for their party.
Oh, really?
Think of Johnson and Truman, both Democrats who were succeeded by Republicans.
Oh, wow.
It kind of throws the race wide open.
Yeah.
And it creates an uphill battle for the party in power.
Yeah.
So now with Biden out of the picture, it'll be fascinating to see how the Democrats navigate this transition.
Right.
They seem surprisingly unified so far, quickly rallying behind Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they have a history of lively debates.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Let's just say that.
Yeah.
But yeah, their ability to present a united front at this critical juncture will likely play a significant role in the 2024 election.
Well, for sure.
It's anyone's game at this point.
It's interesting because it does seem like such a break from tradition, right?
Yeah.
We're so used to presidents.
The two-term thing, yeah.
Especially modern presidents.
To see somebody step away, it's like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, exactly.
Something must be up.
Exactly.
So I guess we'll kind of have to wait and see
how this all
how it all plays out.
unfolds.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it creates some really interesting opportunities and also challenges, right, for both parties.
Right.
I mean, the Republicans were probably gearing up for a rematch against Biden, and now they have to, adjust their strategy entirely.
Totally. It's like they're back to square one.
Yeah, back to the drawing board. Who are they going to run against? What are they going to, what's their whole thing going to be?
And you got to feel for those campaign strategists.
Yeah.
Who are just like, oh, okay.
Time to start over.
Yeah, but this situation also provides a really unique opportunity for the Republicans.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the field is wide open.
Yeah.
It's anybody's game at this point.
Yeah, anybody's game. Speaking of open fields,
yeah,
I was looking at the list of all the presidents who chose to bow out after just one term.
Okay.
Even before the two-term limit became standard practice.
Right.
Like way back.
Right. In the 19th century, it was actually not uncommon for presidents to just do the one term.
Really?
Yeah. They would often campaign on a single-term promise.
Wow.
Yeah,
You'd think that wouldn't be very appealing to voters.
right.
Like, vote for me, I'm only going to do this once.
Yeah.
You think they'd be like, nah, I want someone who's in it for the long haul.
Right. You would think they would want someone who was really going to dig in.
Right. But back then, some voters actually saw it as a sign of integrity, that
Right.
they were just doing their duty and then stepping aside gracefully, like making way for new leadership.
Yeah.
So it was kind of seen as like, I'm not here for power.
I'm here to serve the people.
Yeah, I'm not here to build some dynasty.
Yeah, it was more about putting the country's needs above personal ambition. So it's a very different way of thinking about the office
Yeah.
than we have today.
Yeah, totally.
We're so used to now these presidents wanting to make their mark
Yeah.
and build a legacy. Back then, it was really more about fulfilling a duty and then, getting things done and then moving on.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see how the presidency has evolved. Back then it was like less about building a personal legacy and more about just serving the people for a set period of time.
Exactly. It's interesting, right?
And you can see how that mindset kind of shifted, as you said, with like the rise of figures like FDR, who spent a lot of time in office, and then also the expansion of the federal government.
Right. All that together transformed the presidency into this much more powerful and influential position.
Right. And kind of, I guess, created the expectation that you would stay for 2 terms.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's a reminder that even something as fundamental as the presidency isn't static, right?
Sure.
It's constantly changing, adapting to the times.
It is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about history, but I want to circle back to Biden for a moment.
Sure.
What do you think his decision says about him? And maybe even about the future of the presidency?
Yeah, that's a good question.
You know.
It's interesting because the historian, Kevin Cruz, describes Biden as almost like a weather vane.
A weather vane.
Yeah.
Like going whichever way the wind blows.
Yeah. Someone who kind of has a good sense of where the political winds are blowing.
Yeah.
And a willingness to adapt.
Yeah.
So he doesn't seem to be driven by ideology as much as, I guess you could say, by a desire to find common ground and get things done.
You're saying he's more of a pragmatist than an ideologue?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Okay, so he's not necessarily going to like plant his flag
Right.
on a certain set of beliefs and say, this is what I believe in no matter what.
Exactly. And you can see that in his long career in the Senate, he was known for his ability to build consensus. And he often positioned himself in the middle of the Democratic caucus, even when it meant facing criticism from both sides.
So you're saying he's willing to take the heat?
He's willing to take the heat if it means getting things done. Compromise is, the name of the game for him.
So you're saying this middle-of-the-road approach has kind of been a defining characteristic of his political career?
Yeah, I think so. It's been pretty consistent. And, some would say that's what allowed him to win the presidency in the first place.
Right.
In a time of deep political division, he presented himself as the unifier, someone who could bring the country together.
Right, which was very much needed, I think, at the time.
Yeah, it was definitely a message that resonated with a lot of voters.
But wouldn't you say there's a potential downside to that approach?
Sure.
Right, like some people might view it as lacking conviction or being too willing to compromise on like core principles.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid point. And it's a classic tension, right, in politics. It's idealism versus pragmatism. Do you stick to your principles no matter what? Or do you compromise to achieve your goals? It's a tough question. And I think the answer probably depends on the situation.
Right.
But in Biden's case, I think his decision to step aside could be seen as a pragmatic move, recognizing that his age and the political climate might make it difficult to effectively lead for another 4 years. So it's kind of like a realistic assessment of the situation and saying, okay, maybe it's time for someone else to take over.
Yeah, so it's almost like a selfless act in a way.
Right. Yeah.
Putting the country's needs ahead of his own ambition.
Exactly. Exactly. And it makes you wonder if maybe we'll see more presidents choosing to step aside in the future.
Oh, interesting.
Especially as life expectancy increases and the demands of the job continue to grow.
Right, because it is such a demanding job.
It's a 247 job.
Yeah, it's not like you get to punch out at 5 o'clock.
No.
Go home and relax.
Right.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about Biden and his decision.
Right.
But the Democratic National Convention is actually just a few weeks away.
It is. It's coming up fast.
Yeah, it's scheduled for August 19th to the 22nd.
That's right.
In Chicago. And it's going to be, a pivotal moment for the Democratic Party.
Absolutely. It's their chance to formally nominate Kamala Harris, rally support behind her and their platform, they're going to be looking to project this image of unity and strength as they head into the general election.
Well, especially after
Especially after this.
Biden stepping down.
Yeah, they need to show that they can handle this transition.
Right.
And present a united front.
Well, especially considering their history of,
Right.
let's just say, lively internal debates.
Right. Remember what Will Rogers famously quipped?
Yeah.
I am not a member of an organized political party. I am a Democrat.
Oh, that's a classic.
It's a classic.
But this time around, it seems like they're really determined to avoid that chaos and infighting.
Yeah, I mean, strategically it makes sense, right?
Right.
With Biden stepping down, they need to project stability, confidence, any sign of division, weakness. That's just a gift to the Republicans.
Right. They're going to capitalize on that. So they're really trying to put on this big show of unity.
Absolutely.
Even if there might be some disagreements kind of bubbling beneath the surface.
Right. Well, and politics is often about perception.
Right.
And in this case, the Democrats are trying to control that narrative. They want to be seen as the party of competence, experience, ready to lead the country through these challenging times.
So they're putting on their best poker faces.
Pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
Trying to just project this image of, we got this, don't worry.
Exactly. But we should also remember that conventions can be unpredictable.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, remember what happened in Chicago back in 1968?
Oh, you mean the protests?
Yeah, the anti-war protests that erupted during the Democratic National Convention.
Right, because the Vietnam War was
still raging.
Yeah.
And it had created these deep divisions within the country. And the convention kind of became this focal point for all that tension.
Yeah.
And things turned violent.
Yeah.
The whole event descended into chaos.
So it's really a stark reminder that these political events can become flashpoints for social unrest.
Right. Exactly. It
Which
could
is
happen
just-
really quickly.
It makes you wonder, could we see something similar this time around?
It's certainly possible.
Especially given the ongoing controversies surrounding Biden's policies, you know?
It's a valid concern. But we should also remember that the political climate today is very different from 1968.
That's true, yeah.
Things have changed a lot. But with the rise of social media and the increasing polarization of American politics, it's not out of the realm of possibility that we could see protests. Maybe not to the same extent as 1968, but who
Yeah.
knows?
Right. So it'll be interesting to see how the Democrats navigate this potential challenge, you know, trying to respect the right to protest, but also maintain order and security at their convention.
Exactly.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about, you know, the man who decided to walk away from it all,
Okay.
Joe Biden.
Yeah.
You know, what insights can we glean from his decision?
Well, going back to what we were talking about earlier, Kevin Cruz characterizes Biden as this kind of weather vane in the political landscape.
Mm-hmm.
He has this knack for sensing the direction of the Democratic Party and adapting to the changing political winds.
So not so much a rigid ideologue, but more of a pragmatist who's willing to kind of, you know, adjust his positions to reflect the evolving views of his party, the country.
Exactly. Exactly. And Cruz points to Biden's long Senate career as evidence of this. He consistently positioned himself in the middle of the Democratic caucus, even when it meant taking heat from both the left and the right.
So this middle-of-the-road approach has really been a defining characteristic of his political career.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a strategy that served him well, allowing him to build consensus, get things done.
But wouldn't some argue that it also makes him seem less principled?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's a valid critique.
Like he's more interested in political expediency than in actually, standing up for what he truly believes in.
Yeah, that's a common criticism, I think, of his opponents. They would say that his pragmatism is just another word for flip-flopping.
Right.
That he lacks a strong, core set of beliefs.
So it's this classic debate again.
Exactly.
Idealism versus pragmatism.
It's age-old.
Do you stick to your guns no matter what?
Yeah.
Or do you compromise to achieve your goals?
Yeah. And it's a debate that's played out throughout Biden's career. But his supporters would argue that his pragmatism is a strength, not a weakness.
Right.
And they would say it allows him to actually navigate the complexities of American politics and get things done.
Right. So make actual progress on issues.
Exactly.
Not just be stuck in gridlock.
Right.
Just because you're not willing to budge on anything.
Exactly.
Then it really is a matter of perspective.
I think so.
Right. Some see it as a lack of conviction. Others see it as a practical approach to governing.
Yeah, and I think it's likely that history will continue to debate Biden's legacy through that very lens. Was he a principled leader, or was he a savvy politician who was just willing to bend with the wind?
It's a fascinating question. And it makes you wonder if his decision to step aside could also be seen through this lens of pragmatism.
It's very possible.
Right. Maybe he recognized that his age, the current political climate, would just make it really difficult to win a second term. And maybe he decided to just step aside gracefully
Mm,
rather than risk, a bruising campaign.
right, one that could divide the party even further.
Exactly, especially when they need to be unified going into this next election. So I think, it takes a certain amount of self-awareness to make that kind of decision, especially when you're holding the most powerful office in the world. You know, it's got to be tempting to just cling to that power, try to defy the odds.
I think it's a very human thing to want to hold on to power
Right.
and to think that you can overcome any obstacle.
Yeah. But I guess it speaks to maybe a different kind of strength to be able to step back and say, okay, maybe it's time for someone else.
Right. It's a different kind of leadership.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating and complex decision, and one that I'm sure, historians will be analyzing for years to come.
Oh, absolutely. This is going to be in the textbooks for sure.
Yeah. But regardless of how history ultimately judges Biden, there's no denying that his presidency has been a consequential one.
Oh, for sure. I mean, he led the country through some really challenging times, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the ongoing threat of climate change and all the social and political upheaval we've seen in recent years. I mean, you've got the rise of social justice movements and the increasing polarization of American society. I mean, he's had to navigate all of these really turbulent waters, and his decisions will have a lasting impact
Ugh.
on the country for sure.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that the presidency really is more than just a job.
Right, it is.
It's a huge responsibility that really leaves a mark on the person who holds it.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that often gets lost in the kind of the day-to-day political battles and the media coverage. It's easy to forget that these are human beings
Right.
with their own strengths and weaknesses and flaws
Mm.
who are trying to do their best in incredibly difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And it's a job that comes with a tremendous amount of pressure and scrutiny
Yeah.
and very little privacy.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's important to remember that when we're evaluating these presidents.
Right. To try to see them as people, not just political figures.
Exactly.
Yeah. And, we've been focusing a lot on Biden's decision and what it means for him and for the Democratic Party.
Right.
But it's also important to remember that he's not making these decisions in a vacuum, right? He's part of a much larger system.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He's
Okay.
part of a system with checks and balances. He's part of a political party. He has advisors. He has to consider the needs of the country, the global landscape. I
Right.
mean, there's so many factors at play here. It's not just about him. It's about all of these different forces interacting and shaping the course of events.
It's like he's at the center of this giant web, and every action he takes sends ripples throughout the entire system.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think understanding that broader context is really essential for making sense of presidential decisions and their impact on history.
Well, before we get too lost in the web of history, I want to bring up something that Kevin Cruz said that really resonated with me. He pointed out that the 22nd Amendment, which limits presidents to 2 terms, was passed in direct response to FDR's 4 terms in office.
That's right. It's a direct reaction to that.
And it's just this amazing example of how a single individual can have such a profound and lasting impact on the structure of our government.
I mean, it's really quite remarkable.
It makes you wonder what lasting changes Biden's presidency will bring about,
Right.
even though he's choosing to step aside after just 1 term.
Right. I mean, it's hard to say for sure. It's too early to tell, right?
Yeah.
But it's certainly possible that his decision could have these unintended consequences down the road.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for one thing, it might encourage other aging politicians to kind of rethink their own ambitions.
Right.
It could lead to this generational shift in leadership,
Right.
which some people would say is long overdue.
Yeah. There's definitely been a lot of talk about the need for younger voices in government. So maybe Biden's decision will be the catalyst for that change.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Maybe so. It's really hard to say.
Yeah.
But it highlights, again, the dynamic nature of history, right? We're not just these passive observers. Our actions shape the future in ways that we can't always predict.
Right. Our choices matter. It's a powerful thought. It reminds me of that famous quote, "The only thing constant is change."
Exactly. And as we head into this next election cycle, it's really important to remember that we're all participants in this ongoing story. The decisions we make, the leaders we choose, these things will determine the direction of the country for years to come.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. We've explored the historical precedents of presidents choosing not to run for a second term, talked about the changing nature of the presidency, and kind of started to unpack the implications of Biden's decision, for both his party and the country.
Yeah, and it's really been a fascinating discussion. And we've seen how these personal factors and political calculations and historical trends, they all intertwine and influence these monumental decisions. And I think,
Right.
Biden's decision to step aside is really this unique moment in American political history that deserves our careful attention.
And as we head into the 2024 election, it's more important than ever to stay informed,
Hmm.
engage in thoughtful discussions, and most importantly, exercise your right to vote.
Couldn't agree more. The
Okay.
future of our democracy is literally in our hands.
It really is fascinating to see how these historical threads connect, and influence the political landscape that we see today.
Yeah.
And it's, as we've been talking about all these presidents who chose to walk away, it's made me think about the toll that this job must take on a person.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's easy to kind of romanticize the presidency, but the reality is it's an incredibly demanding and stressful position.
Oh, I'm sure.
The weight of the world is quite literally on their shoulders.
Yeah, and the constant scrutiny from the media, the public, even from within their own party. I mean, it's got to be relentless.
It's absolutely relentless. It's a 247 job. There's no real time off. Every
Yeah.
decision they make, every word they say is just analyzed and dissected.
Right.
So, yeah, it's really no wonder that some presidents choose to step back after one term,
Yeah.
especially as they get older and the demands of the job maybe start to outweigh the rewards.
Right. I guess even the most powerful people in the world need a break sometimes.
Exactly.
But speaking of powerful people, let's talk about Vice President Kamala Harris for a second.
Okay.
With Biden stepping down, she's now in this really unique position to potentially become the first female president of
Yes.
the United States.
That's right. And it brings us back to this other really fascinating, I guess, historical thread
Right.
that we touched on earlier. Remember we were talking about the changing role of the vice presidents?
Yeah, yeah. How it went from being this political dead end
Yeah,
to a potential launching pad to
exactly.
the presidency.
And that shift can be traced back to the same era as the rise of the imperial presidency.
Right.
The 19th century, the vice presidency was seen as this largely ceremonial role.
Hmm.
I mean, John Nance Garner, who was FDR's first vice president,
Hmm.
he famously said that the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit.
Wow, that's
Pretty harsh.
a pretty harsh assessment. You can't imagine a vice president saying that today.
Yeah, no, not at all.
So times have definitely changed.
Times have changed. But back then, the real path to the presidency was actually through the Secretary of State.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But with the 22nd Amendment limiting presidents to 2 terms,
Right.
the vice presidency took on this whole new significance.
Right.
It became this much more visible and influential role.
Okay, so it became a stepping stone.
It became a stepping stone to the presidency.
Gotcha. So Biden stepping down not only creates this opening for the Republicans, but it also potentially sets the stage for this historic first
Right.
of female president,
It's pretty amazing.
which would be pretty amazing.
It would be a landmark moment in American history.
Yeah, it would. So, we talked about that idea of a second term curse.
Yeah.
And you said it's not like a hard and fast rule,
Right.
but there's definitely this pattern that we've seen,
Mhm.
throughout history. What are some of the factors that kind of contribute to this?
Well, like we talked about before, second-term presidents often face more scrutiny
Hmm.
from the media and the public
Huh.
because they've had 4 years to make mistakes.
Right.
And, their opponents they're just waiting to pounce on any little misstep or gaffe.
It's like they're under this microscope and everyone's just looking for those cracks in their armor.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
And, they might also face more opposition from within their own party as well.
Right.
Ambitious rivals might start jockeying for position, trying to kind of set themselves up for that next election.
It's like the sharks start circling once they sense weakness.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And let's not forget that second-term presidents often have to deal with the consequences of their first-term decisions.
Oh, right.
Policies that seemed popular or effective initially, maybe they start to unravel or unforeseen challenges arise.
It's like the chickens come home to roost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all of these things can kind of combine to create this sense of fatigue or disillusionment among the public.
Yeah.
And that can make it really difficult for a second-term president to maintain their momentum.
Yeah.
and achieve their goals.
Yeah, it's almost like the honeymoon period is over. And people are starting to get a little bit more critical.
Hmm.
So it's not so much a curse as just, like you said, maybe this confluence of challenges that kind of come with a second term.
Yeah, it's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even the most successful presidents, they're not immune to the pressures and the pitfalls of power.
It's a really sobering thought. It makes you realize that the presidency is not just about individual ambition or achievement, but about navigating this really complex web
Right.
of relationships and institutions and historical forces.
Yeah, it's like this tapestry that's constantly being woven.
Right.
And the president is just one thread
Right.
among many.
Yeah.
And you have to consider all of these other factors,
Mhm.
the other threads that are shaping the pattern.
Okay, well, that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good note to end on. We've delved deep into the history of single-term presidencies, explored the motivations, the challenges, the potential consequences. We've seen how these personal factors and political calculations and historical trends all kind of intertwine.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating journey through the annals of American political history.
And we've examined how Biden's decision to step aside kind of fits into that broader context, while also creating its own unique kind of ripples in the political landscape.
Exactly.
And as we move forward, it's important to keep these insights in mind as you kind of observe the unfolding drama of the 2024 election.
Absolutely. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll see another president choose to walk away from a second term, adding another chapter to this really interesting story.
That's a great point. History is always being written, and we're all part of it.
We are. We're living through history right now.
Yeah.
And the choices we make, they matter.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.
Yes. Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.